Good day. Today is Sunday, 21st September 2025, and as you can all see, I am back in London in my library after a fascinating and indeed wonderful visit to Chicago, to the United States, to the Integrity Media presentations and awards in Chicago. Now, I should say that I have a lot to do at the moment in London to reconnect with my family, and in addition, I am frankly rather jet-lagged. So that inevitably means that, again, today's video will be shorter than usual. From tomorrow, it will be normal business again, just to say. Anyway, let's quickly turn to the overall situation in the world. And I would begin briefly by saying that Prime Minister Starmer of Great Britain is apparently intending to announce later today, probably by the time you've watched this program, he's about to announce British recognition of the Palestinian state. A performative act of no significance whatsoever in terms of British policy. It's not going to change British policy in any way. It has resulted in some criticism of Starmer from all the usual quarters, but it ultimately changes nothing. As I've discussed in my recent programs, the drift of events in the Middle East, once supported by Britain, is towards renewed war, continued war in Gaza, a renewed attack on Iran, and a decision next month to proceed with snapback sanctions against Iran. Anyway, I am not going to discuss this issue today in this program. It's just that likely you'll be hearing a lot of news about it from the British media and in other places. But in my opinion, it is a matter of slight significance unless a new government takes power in London, which is prepared to fundamentally change British policy in the Middle East, of which I have to say, so far, I see little sign. Anyway, let's turn to that other big conflict, the one that dominates the topics of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to suggest that we're going to see again, over the next couple of days, renewed diplomatic activity. President Trump is expected to go to New York to attend the United Nations General Assembly session next week. And the result is that the focus of international diplomacy nowadays, mostly, though not always, tends to be where he is. A couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, the focus of attention was, of course, in China, where they were celebrating their victory in the Second World War, and where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was having a meeting. I discussed all those meetings in depth, and I pointed out that these were the most substantive and important meetings of the year. So 2 weeks ago, it was China. It was in China that the focus of diplomacy was. But unless Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin decide to take big moves in foreign policy does, or at least international affairs, do seem to revolve around the personality of Donald Trump, who seems to dominate the international weather, if I can put it like that, political weather. Whether he does anything big and important or small and insignificant. I am not sure what President Trump expects to do when he goes to the General Assembly in New York. I've not heard of any major announcement pending or any new program of action being unveiled, but the mere fact of his presence already means that diplomats from around the world are clustering to New York to see what they can do to influence Donald Trump in any particular direction. And of course, when I talked about diplomats, perhaps one should put a question mark over whether he really is a diplomat or has any understanding of diplomacy as it is properly conducted. But Vladimir Zelensky has already made clear that he is again going to leave his country. He is rarely in his country now, as far as I can see. He's going to dash to New York to have another meeting with Donald Trump. And his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, has had a telephone conversation with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, apparently to prepare the ground for this meeting. It's really strange that the Ukrainians seem to think that Donald Trump is particularly interested in what they're coming to say. But anyway, Zelensky's given his interviews to the Western media. I discussed this in my recent program. He's spoken about his frustration and exasperation that sanctions, massive sanctions, have not so far been imposed on the Russians. He clearly wants more weapons. He clearly wants more money. He clearly is anxious to keep the Americans on side. He is probably deeply upset and frustrated that what he thought he had managed to get the Americans to commit to back in July, bone-crushing sanctions against the Russians and their trading partners, and what he'd then also thought that he'd managed to get the Americans to commit to. Security guarantees for Ukraine, paving the way for Ukraine eventually to enter NATO. Anyway, he's probably bitterly disappointed that none of that has happened, that there's been lots of discussions and lots of talk and lots of meetings in Europe, but so far nothing in the way of action with respect to either of these things. And his friend, Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, is keen, apparently, to give Zelensky a helping hand with this forthcoming meeting with Trump, at which Zelensky is no doubt going to try to raise all of these issues and to press Trump to move forward with all of them. So President Stubb has said in another interview, by the way, to the British media, also to The Guardian, clearly this is coordinated. Zelensky spoke to The Guardian some days ago. Now it is Stubb's turn. Stubb, of course, also wants sanctions against the Russians. He wants action to force the Russians to come to terms. And he also says that the security guarantees that will be provided to the Ukraine by the Western powers, if, of course, they are ever provided to Ukraine by the Western powers, must be such as would oblige the Western powers to fight Russia on behalf of Ukraine were Russia ever to attack Ukraine again after some kind of peace agreement was reached. And Stubb said that the Russians have no say at all in the matter. Now, when President Stubb talks in this way, you can quite clearly see, again, that the ultimate objective is to get Ukraine into NATO. Because what differs in substance from NATO membership and the kind of security guarantees that Stubb is proposing? If this proposal were ever to be adopted by the United States, by President Trump, it would in effect mean that the entire diplomacy, the entire diplomatic outreach to the Russians, to the extent that it even exists at all, would simply collapse. President Stubb might say that it is not for the Russians to insist on security guarantees being framed in the way that they wish, that the Russians have no veto over Ukraine's security guarantees, just as supposedly the Russians have no veto over Ukraine's future membership of NATO. That, of course, has been the disastrous mantra that has brought us to this crisis in the first place. The insistence that the Russians have no say in a matter which touches on their security. Anyway, Stubb repeats it. He repeats that mantra. I suspect, thinks that he's lending support to Zelensky in advance of Zelensky's meeting with Trump in New York. But I am going to express my own belief to the extent that President Trump is aware of these comments by President Stubb, and of course Stubb claims to be and has presented himself as being and has been reported in the media in the West on occasion as being President Trump's friend. But to the extent that President Trump is aware of what Stubb is talking about, and notice that Stubb has repeatedly said that Trump is on the brink of finally losing patience with the Russians, of imposing massive sanctions on the Russians, of coming down hard on the Russians. Stubb has said this many, many times. He said it repeatedly and has done so with the alleged authority of being Donald Trump's friend. Just saying. Anyway, if Stubb really were Donald Trump's friend, if he really had familiarized himself with the American position, with at least the Trump administration's position, or to be more precise, with Donald Trump's own position, he would know by now what I think has become absolutely clear over the last 3.5 years, and certainly since Donald Trump became president again of the United States, that the United States is not prepared to fight the Russians on behalf of Ukraine. It is not prepared to send troops to Ukraine. It is not prepared to send troops or to intervene in order to support European troops who go into Ukraine. There is no conceivable way that the United States will come through on any of the things that Zelensky or Stubb are demanding, unless there is a political transformation in Washington, which I have to say, even for Trump's volatile personality, I think unlikely, and which Trump anyway is unlikely to do, because, to be frank, I think it would go completely against the wishes of his political base, and I think he understands that very well. In addition, President Trump presumably continues to receive advice from the Pentagon, from people like Elbridge Colby. They are not keen on a further unlimited commitment to Ukraine. And as I discussed in a recent program, it looks as if, because of shortages of Patriot missiles, they've again put a stop to their supply to Europe and, of course, ultimately to Ukraine as well. So Zelensky and Stubb and others are continuing to work to try to get the Americans more deeply and directly involved in the Ukrainian conflict, oblivious to the repeated messages that have been coming out of Washington, that on the contrary, the United States currently is looking for ways to extricate itself from the morass, the geopolitical and diplomatic and logistical morass that is the war in Ukraine. After all, what were all those events those strange events that we've been hearing so much about over the last 10 days or so. The drone incursion into Ukraine, the incursion by the single drone into Romania, the furore whipped up over the overflight of the MiG-31 fighter jets, allegedly over an uninhabited rock in the Baltic Sea, though the Russians, of course, denied that even that is true. What was all that about, if not a further attempt to get the Americans ultimately more deeply involved in Ukraine? And notice the most important fact about all of those incidents, which is that the United States, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his officials have refused to be drawn. They have not made the kind of commitments that the way in which those incidents were handled by the Europeans were intended that the Americans should make. So I'm going to make a prediction. I think what will probably happen is that Zelensky will come to New York. He will have another meeting with Donald Trump. People again be told what a wonderful meeting that meeting was. Zelensky will come away pleased, or apparently pleased. He will say that he's made huge progress with Trump. Trump will say much the same. And then, as has repeatedly happened over the last few weeks, when the Ukrainians and the Europeans come to pass what Trump has actually said over the course of this meeting, what commitments Trump has actually made over the course of this meeting, it becomes clear that he's made no real substantive commitments at all. We've seen this play out over the last few weeks with the issue of the bone-crushing sanctions, an apparently clear statement made in July that the president was going to impose 100% tariffs on China and India if they stop buying Russian oil, if the Russians also refused a ceasefire in Ukraine. That has melted away. And the various discussions that took place immediately before and after the Alaska summit about security guarantees, about deployments of Western troops in Ukraine, that's also melted away also. If by now the Europeans and the Ukrainians haven't grasped that in his own overcomplicated way, the president is also stringing them along, then frankly, I don't think they will ever understand it, which makes this whole tiresome business repeat itself continuously in the way that we see. Anyway, it's not only Zelensky who's going to New York. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is off to New York as well. And he does not apparently intend to meet President Trump. He's going to meet foreign ministers and senior officials of many countries. I suspect that for Lavrov, the major topic of discussion over the course of his meeting, of his visit to New York and of his various meetings whilst he is in New York, is not going to be the situation in Ukraine, but on the contrary, the situation in the Middle East. Though again, things might change and we'll have to wait and see. But we do know that at some point over the course of this visit, Lavrov is going to meet with Rubio. He's going to have a meeting with Rubio, and apparently the topic is going to be Russian-American relations, though of course they will touch on the topic of Ukraine too. And well, here I am going to say that the Russians have been pushing very hard over the last couple of days. The issue of the restoration of direct air links between Russia and the United States. I do think this is probably likely to come. As I've discussed already, the restoration of direct air links between the United States and Belarus, which can only happen if Belarusian airlines use Russian territory. Just saying. But even if only American airlines fly to Minsk, it still means that Russians who want to travel to the United States can do so by going to Minsk, which they can very easily access, and provided they've got themselves the right visa, buying themselves a ticket on that American flight and flying directly to the United States. It's been much more difficult to do that until now, but we are perhaps closer to the point where Russians, at least in Western Russia, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, will be able to travel to the United States using direct air links from Kiev, from Minsk. But the Russians, understandably, are saying, well, let's move forward and let's do this directly with each other. It's not going to make any major difference in terms of the sanctions. It's not going to erode the economic effect of the sanctions, but it is going to make life for everybody much easier. And what is the point of punishing, penalizing ordinary people by refusing direct air links? Surely person-to-person contacts is something we want to facilitate, not something we want to end. I'm not sure how the Americans are going to respond to these demands, but I do think that their decision to establish direct air links with Belarus is a step in that direction. Anyway, we will see what comes. By the way, if the Americans do announce that they're restoring direct air links with Russia, this will be extremely badly received in Kiev. Zelensky will be furious, and the European leadership will be extremely angry about it as well. They will not be pleased in any way. And given that Trump is meeting with Zelensky in New York, I don't think anything like that, obviously, is going to be announced over the course of that visit. If the Americans were to announce the restoration of direct air links between Russia and the United States at the same time as the New York General Assembly session was underway, then it would be a massive, massive humiliation of Zelensky on the eve of his meeting with Trump. And I don't think the Americans are prepared to go that far at this time. But anyway, all of that is in the air. Now, one should not underestimate the importance of restoring direct air links. It is a small thing that can have a significant moral effect and which can change the political atmosphere. But the other thing that perhaps Rubio and Lavrov need to talk about, and I hope will talk about, is the situation with arms control. The START treaty is set to expire in February. Some kind of negotiations and discussions are urgently needed, at the very least in order to extend the START treaty. And if that doesn't happen, at least to begin a new process of direct negotiations between Russia and the United States to make sure that the whole system of arms limitation which is, to be clear, in deep crisis already, doesn't simply break down. It is very likely that we're going to see a renewed conflict in the Middle East. Iran is already saying that it will sever once and for all and conclusively contacts with the IAEA if snapback sanctions are imposed in October. It is likely that we're going to see renewed conflict in the Middle East. We already see moves by important Middle East players which might ultimately lead to a further erosion of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You can argue that the security agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which remember is a nuclear weapons power, is one step undermining, which could ultimately undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. One can imagine how, under the provisions of that treaty, Saudi Arabia might turn to Pakistan in a crisis for military support, which could extend to nuclear weapons deployments and even transfers between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. It has been talked about. And of course, if there are further attacks upon Iran, the probability, or at least the possibility, that Iran might decide that it has no realistic option if it is to guarantee its security other than to go down the nuclear route, that possibility becomes, in my opinion, very high. So, in this kind of fraught situation, it's essential that at least the two big nuclear powers, which remain the United States and Russia, are in contact with each other and are working to secure the system of arms control. It astonishes me, given the enormity of the stakes involved, that nobody is talking about this with anything like the degree of urgency that this topic deserves. Anyway, let's move on. So that's the diplomacy. A lot of it, as I said, ultimately performative. As I said at the start of the program, Keir Starmer's decision to recognize the Palestinian state is performative. The actions of the Americans and the Ukrainians relative to each other is performative also. But perhaps, just possibly, in the midst of all of this theatre, something might actually happen if Rubio and Lavrov can come to at least some agreements about some matters, direct air links being one, a resumption of discussions about nuclear weapons and arms control is another. It is said that the President of the United States is obsessed with obtaining the Nobel Peace Prize. I've been very skeptical about those claims initially, but some of the things he said do make me wonder. Well, I'm going to suggest to him, if he's listening, which of course he isn't, and to members of his administration, that if the president really wants to do something that really does secure world peace, then a good place to start is by getting nuclear talks with the Russians again underway, and the focus there, at least initially, should be on getting the START treaty extended. Anyway, so a lot of that going on, and of course, in the meantime, the Europeans are moving forward with their 19th and probably, I'm guessing, ultimate final sanctions package. And The other thing they will no doubt be trying to do, and Zelensky will be trying to do, over the course of the General Assembly session, is they're going to try to get Donald Trump to work further in their direction on the sanctions front too. Now, the obsession, and this has clearly been said now by Ursula von der Leyen and by Kaja Kallas and by others, is to stop the money flows to Putin's war machine. And the Europeans have actually been talking about this since 2022. This has been a constant thing, that the purpose of the sanctions is to somehow cut off the flow of money to the Russian budget, which in turn it is assumed will translate into a cut off of money flows to the Russian military, which it is assumed will force Putin, it's always Putin, to the negotiating table, where he will meekly accept the extraordinary demands for Russia's total capitulation that the European powers and the Americans in the past, at least, and of course the Ukrainians have been making. The entire premise is completely absurd, and I've discussed this many times. It assumes that Russian economic resources, which are of course overwhelmingly domestic, just saying, I mean, Russian industry, Russian energy, Russian agriculture are located inside Russia. So the Russian military, the Russian government will continue to receive proceeds from oil and gas sales, including in Russia, and they'll be able to increase supplies, lower prices for oil and gas inside Russia if, in any notional universe, exports of these things were to end. And of course, Russian factories will continue to work and provide weapons for the military. And, well, it is impossible to see how this can work. Now, as I've said already, the Russians up to now have been running a peacetime economy, not a war economy, as the Europeans endlessly claim. But if the Americans and the Europeans were to get together and were really successful in cutting off Russia's export flows, the most likely outcome of that would be that the Russians would move to a wartime mobilization economy, for which they have all the means to do, and they are likely to do that because victory in Ukraine is their priority. Now, as I said, why people in the West find this obvious fact so difficult to understand, it absolutely escapes me. That is what countries which are at war do. If I could just say, I mean, in the Second World War, the Western Allies made titanic efforts to crush the German economy on the assumption that doing that through air power and cutting off Germany's trade links would be enough to force the Germans to peace, or at least, if not to peace, to political collapse. It never happened. Why assume that Russia, which is a continental self-sufficient economy in a way that Germany's was not, why assume that the Russians will respond any differently? Why assume that their political system will collapse or their ability to wage war will end? Anyway, I'm not going to devote more time to discussing this topic, at least not in this program. But regardless of that, we now have had an article in the New York Times which finally takes a somewhat more realistic view of the Shadow Fleet situation. And one of the things that really urgently needs to happen, by the way, if discussion is to start becoming serious on this topic, is that it would be best if people in the West stopped using that inane expression, shadow fleet, which, as I said, gives the whole enterprise a kind of Pirates of Caribbean quality, which is ridiculous. It simply exposes the complete lack of understanding of these matters on the part of the decision makers in North America and in Europe, who have been making the decisions here. Anyway, I am not going to discuss this article in detail. All I will say is that if you read it, you will find all kinds of things that we on the Duran have been saying for, well, at least a year, maybe longer, on this topic. I mean, the article, for example, admits that what the sanctions have done is that they have created a massive increase in ships that conduct Russia's overseas trade outside the Western insurance systems. That's the reality of it. I mean, they come up with all kinds of other words. They say that the sanctions have resulted in an enormous increase in the size of Russia's shadow fleet. First of all, it's not even Russia's. Most of these ships don't belong to Russian ship owners, just to say. But the point is, we're not talking about a fleet with a single commander and a captain, wickedly organising some wicked maritime operation, in the way that Captain Teach or those exotic characters of the 18th century who used to navigate the Caribbean once did. What we have is a massive expansion of ships and ship owners who understand that shipping goods produced in Russia and which are in high demand on international markets is an extremely lucrative business, and who are prepared to undertake that business, but to do so in a way that, whilst perfectly legal, means that they operate outside the cover of Western insurance groups. That's what it's all about. But the New York Times admits that ships can participate in this trade. Then when Western governments try to sanction these ships, as they sometimes do, the ships simply change their name, they change their registration, trying to keep up with this constant movement of ships into and out of the system, the maritime system, is all but impossible. There will always be ships, there will always be captains, there will always be ship owners, because the demand for Russian goods, for oil and liquefied natural gas and grain and increasingly, by the way, manufactured goods, is there and is likely to grow. And bear in mind that one of the two of the countries that are involved in buying goods from the Russians, well, China, I understand, has by far the biggest merchant fleet in the world. Just saying. And India has a significant merchant fleet also. Maybe it would be more correct to say that there are a lot of ships trading the seas whose ownership can ultimately be traced back to Indian owners. So this whole idea of going after the shadow fleet is like taking a hammer to mist. You can bang your hammer, but the mist will still be there. It will just float around and be unaffected by what you do. Some individuals obviously will be affected, but we're talking about an extremely tough industry in which people always work in conditions of risk. The risk in this case is not so high that it can ever set off against the enormous business advantages. Anyway, the Europeans don't seem to get this, and of course, inevitably, they are going to proceed with this plan. Now, what they are actually doing is that they're not really sanctioning the Russians. That is now that window of opportunity to sanctions the Russians, if it ever existed, has now gone. The big story of the last, 2 months has been the fact that Russia's major trade partners, China, India, the other BRIC states, have stood by Russia. Saudi Arabia, by the way, has also stood by Russia. I mean, Russia continues to be part of OPEC Plus. Relations between the Russians and the Saudis continue as before. When I say that these countries have stood by Russia, more correctly, these countries have pursued their national economic interests by continuing their economic connections with Russia. We should, I think, not overlook how completely bizarre, how fantastic this Western idea is, that because the Western powers have some issue with the Russians, the rest of the world should stop trading with them. This is an idea that is outlandish to the point of absurdity. But anyway, in the past, in the 18th century, for example, the British would seize ships on the high seas which traded with the French. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. But bear in mind that one government which vigorously protested against the British doing that and insisted that what the British were doing was illegal was none other than the government of the United States. And moreover, the British did that when they were actually at war with France. The Western powers, the Western countries, as they always tell us, are not at war with Russia. So they try, even whilst they say that they are not at war with Russia, to force other countries that are not at war with Russia either, but which have good relations with Russia, to stop having good economic relations with Russia, simply because they don't agree with what Vladimir Putin and the Russians are doing in Ukraine. This is nonsense. Anyway, the Europeans are still stuck with this, and they're pressing forward with it. And of course, they're not sanctioning the Russians, really. They are sanctioning themselves. Now, there has been a interesting commentary about the state of the German economy, and it's been provided by the German Engineering Federation, the VDMA. They say that they've issued a statement. They say that a rebound in the German economy this autumn has failed to materialize. The Federal Statistics Office has revised Germany's GDP decline for the second quarter of 2025 from minus 0.1% to minus 0.3%. And the German Association, the Machinery Association, these are the people who make the machine tools and the engineering equipment that keep the rest of the German industrial machine working, and which, by the way, have historically been amongst Germany's most successful exports. Anyway, they now say that they've made a new forecast, and their president, Bertram Kavlat, says we had previously expected a decline of 2%. Now we anticipate minus 5% for 2025. And Kavlat goes on to say that the industry, this is the German machine industry, is now at a tipping point. And he says, if action is not taken now, voters will be pushed into the arms of the political extremes. And obviously he's talking about the AfD, which is now polling. It's further increased in the polls. It's now apparently at 27%. It's, I believe, the most popular party in Germany. So here we see Kavlat. He's trying to get the German political class, get them to wake up to the extent of the crisis, the intensifying pace of deindustrialization in Germany, by working on their fears of the AfD. Though I have to say that he also pulls his punches. Again, he talks mostly about the cost for German industry of the Green New Deal and all of that. And I'm not discounting the effect of that, at least to some extent. But as I've discussed in many programs, as we've said often on the Duran, the primary reason why the German economy has been falling into ever deepening recession is not because of the Green Deal, but because of the sudden decision taken back in 2022 to stop importing cheap pipeline gas from Russia and to replace it instead with expensive liquefied natural gas supplied mostly from the United States. And anyway, we learned that industrial production in Germany today is now all but impossible, that machinery production in Germany fell by 7% last year, and as we see, the trend is going to continue with a further 5% decline this year. Electricity prices, industrial electricity prices in Germany are roughly 3 times higher than they are in the United States. The Americans are now imposing tariffs on German exports to the United States. And the single most extraordinary figure that I read somewhere recently is that overall manufacturing production in Germany today is 20% below its pre-pandemic point in 2019. So that is a massive contraction. It's a contraction that is gathering pace and which frankly at the moment simply looks unstoppable. And unless there is some moment when this changes, and that moment has to come soon, then I agree with Kavlat. The German economy is at a tipping point, and we're going to see a further big decline. Now, if you go to places which examine European decision making, other than the Duran itself, of course, if you go, for example, to Euro Intelligence, this new magazine, where, as I said, Wolfgang Munchau appears to be the main intellectual force. Anyway, it's absolutely clear that there is no actual program, no actual plan in Germany to address any of these problems at all. Friedrich Merz seems incapable of doing so because, as I've said in many places, his priority is the war against Russia. He doesn't seem to have any ideas currently other than that. Just saying. So anyway, that's what the Europeans are doing. They continue to chase Donald Trump. They continue to impose more sanctions on themselves, calling them sanctions against Russia. And the overall situation in Europe gets worse and worse. When finally the penny drops and the people of Europe understand, and one day they will, what their leaders have been doing over the last 3.5 years, well, it will be very interesting to report about it. That's all I'm going to say about that today. Now, it's important to remember that we are still in a war in Ukraine, and the war continues to escalate and to intensify. And I noticed that Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which, as I have pointed out in recent programs, has given us far and away the most accurate account of the Battle of Pakrovsk up till now. It is now publishing an article, which says that the climactic part of the battle for Donbass is about to start. That the major battle for Donbass, the battle where the Russians finally break Ukrainian resistance in Donbass, and by doing so, by the way, essentially win the war, that battle is about to begin. Now, I'm going to quickly say something about Radovka, which I've not said before. Their description of events in the Pakrovsk area has been so accurate that I can only assume that they are actually being briefed about the situation there by senior people within Russia's military leadership, almost certainly with the full knowledge of the Russian General Staff. I cannot understand otherwise how they can be so well informed. Anyway, we've had more news from Pakrovsk, and it all speaks about the situation continuing to move steadily and remorselessly in Russia's favor. More advances inside the city itself. The Russians seem to be determined to not only reach the railway now in central Pakrovsk, but probably to capture the railway station as well. They are looking to break Ukrainian resistance in the high-rise area in southeast Pakrovsk, where one suspects the greater part of the Ukrainian forces are concentrated, by basically choking off supply to those forces by closing off the road links. And Well, we've now had more news from outside Pakrovsk. First of all, the latest reports all seem to show that the Russians have indeed cleared the area to the southeast of Pakrovsk of Ukrainian defenders. There's a village there called Novopavlivka, which should not be confused with a much bigger village, also by that name, in Dnipropetrovsk region. But the Novopavlivka that is located to the southeast of Pakrovsk is an important position, and there are reasons to believe that the Russians have captured it. And the Russians seem now, exactly as Radovka has said, to have successfully repelled Ukrainian attacks in the area of the Russian breakthrough. In fact, the latest reports suggest that in the areas of Vladimirovka, the village which the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured, and other villages around there, it is the Russians now who are back on the attack, that the 1st Azov Corps has basically exhausted itself in the counterattacks, and that it is now the time for the Russians to go back on to the attack again. So again, it's not always easy to get a full picture, even from Radovka. But the last week, I think, has seen a significant step taken towards the fall of Pakrovsk. I don't know how much longer this battle will continue for. The Russians, as I was advised a couple of weeks ago, are using Pakrovsk like they used Bakhmut as a meat grinder to grind down Ukrainian forces by getting Ukraine to assign its best brigades to the defense of Pakrovsk. So it could be that the Russians want this battle to continue a little longer. Just saying. But anyway, the battle goes on, and eventually it will end with the Russians having captured the city, the town. And the Russians advance also in other places too. There's been considerable reports, for example, of more Russian advances in the Siversk and especially Liman areas. There was an important village called Shandrigalova, north of the town of Liman, which apparently the Russians have now fully captured. So it looks as if this important village has also fallen. And the Ukrainians, as I think I discussed in my program yesterday, launched some counterattacks in the Kupiansk area, apparently intending to break the siege there, but these attacks were unsuccessful. Anyway, I will provide a more detailed summary of the military situation in either my next video or one of the ones that I'm going to be making fairly shortly. I would say that I've had from a very, very reliable source more information about the recent Russian drone attack on the Kremenchuk bridge, the bridge across the Dnieper in Kremenchuk. This was a drone attack carried out by 11 Duran drones. And the reports say, the information I'm getting says that the Russians weren't attacking the bridge as such. The primary target was not yet the bridge, but some object that was either located on the bridge or which was actually crossing it. Now, there's no word as to what that object was, but it could have been some individual. And if it was some individual, some important official, then that gives further grounds for saying that the Russians have indeed taken the gloves off and are coming after important individuals within Ukraine's structure, political and military structures, even at the cost of using 11 Duran drones, of which, of course, they now have an ever-increasing supply. Of course, it is only my guess that it was an individual. It could have been something else. It might have been a missile and a missile launcher, which was being ferried across the bridge with the intention of conducting a strike into Russia, for example. Either a Sapsan or a Taurus missile, or maybe the Flamingo missile, about which a few weeks ago we were hearing so much, and about which I noticed we now hear nothing at all. Anyway, an interesting twist to that story, and no doubt there's much more to say. But this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.